The initial stop loss. This is placed at the time of the trade. It is the first placement of your stop loss and will be the farthest away from the entry that the stop loss will ever be. There will be one of two places the initial stop loss can be placed. The first is above or below the TBM. That'll be the red or green dots on the chart. Number two is above or below the TBS, and that's the red or green line on the chart. In a long trade, the initial stop loss will be placed either just below the TBM that's on the chart, it'll be the green dots, or just under the TBS, and that's the green line. There will be times when you have the option between the two, between the TBM and the TBS, as they are both on the chart under the signal candle at the same time. The conservative stop would be the one that is farthest from the entry, and the aggressive stop would be the one that is closest to the entry. In the chart example that you see below, the TBM would be considered the aggressive stop because it is closest to the entry. The TBS would be considered the conservative stop because it is farthest away from the entry. In the instance of an aggressive trade signal, when only 3 of the 4 indicators have turned green, either the green TBM or the green TBS will be present on the price chart under the market. The initial stop loss will be placed just below whichever one is there. Now, if you take a look at the first image, the bottom left, the initial stop loss has to be placed under the TBS because there is no TBM. The second image on the right, the stop loss must be placed under the TBM as it's the only option. There is no TBS present. In a short trade, the initial stop loss will be placed either just above the TBM on the chart, these will be the red dots, or just above the TBS, that's the red line. Again, there will be times where you have the option between the two, between the TBM and the TBS, as they are both on the chart above the signal candle. The conservative stop would be the one that is farthest from the entry, and the aggressive stop would be the one that is closest to the entry. Now, in the image that you see on the chart below, the conservative stop is placed just above the TBS, as it is farthest from the entry. The aggressive stop would be placed just over the TBM, the dots, as it is closest to the entry. Again, in the instance when an aggressive trade is signaled and only 3 of the 4 indicators have turned red, either the red TBM or the red TBS will be present on the price chart above the market. Now, the initial stop loss will be placed just above whichever one is there. In the left-hand side, you can see that the stop loss is placed above the TBS, as there is no TBM present. And on the right side chart, the stop loss is placed only over the TBM, as we do not have the option to place it over the TBS. Profit target. Profit targets will mainly be based off your initial stop loss. Knowing how far away your initial stop loss is in pips from your entry is the starting point for determining your take profit level. 1-to-1. Now, once you know how many pips your initial stop loss is from your entry, the 1-to-1 profit target will be that same number. For example, if your initial stop loss is 21 pips, your profit target will also be 21 pips. This is the most common and the safest placement of your profit target. In choppy market conditions, the market won't always move very far, so we want what will give us the best chances for a successful trade, and the 1-to-1 becomes the best option. This is an example of a 1-to-1 profit target. The yellow line on the chart is where we entered the trade, and down below the red line is an initial aggressive stop loss for 35 pips. The green line then becomes 35 pips in profit. The green line is our take profit 35 pips away, the same number as the initial stop loss. A 2-to-1. Now, we have 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 10-to-1. These numbers refer to what's called the reward to risk ratio. Now, if you're risking 10 pips, the reward in a 2-to-1 scenario will be 20 pips. A 20 pip reward for a 10 pip risk, 2-to-1. The 2-to-1 reward to risk ratio is a really nice option for traders. The wins are always twice as big as the biggest losses, so you can lose 2 trades for every 1 winner and still break even. You can lose twice as often as you win and not lose any money. In order to make money with a 2-to-1 scenario, you have to win more than 33% of the time. And with Tradeonics, this isn't going to be too hard to do. This chart example is that example of a 2-to-1. We entered short on the close of the signal candle, which is represented by the yellow line. The initial stop loss goes above the TBM, and this example makes it 22 pips. The take profit is down below at twice 22 pips, so the 2-to-1 take profit is 44 pips. Trailing stop loss. A trailing stop loss is a critical component to making money in the markets. Trailing your stop loss means you'll be reducing the risk on your trade as the trade progresses. We want to never lose the full amount of our initial risk if we can avoid it. So trailing your stop loss is the way we accomplish this. If we risk 2% on a trade, for example, we never want to lose the full 2% if we can help it. We will lose the full amount from time to time, but most of the time we can reduce our stop so that if the trade does go bad, we will be taken out of the trade with a loss of 1% or 0.5% or even break even. That would be 0% or no loss at all. There are two ways to trail our stop loss using the Tradeonics system. Number one is using the TBM, and number two is using the TBS. Trailing our stop loss will help us reduce the risk on our trade, and it can also help us make money on a trade that doesn't hit the take profit. Once the stop loss starts being trailed, it will start out by getting closer to our entry level. Getting stopped out here would allow us to lose less than our initial risk on the trade. If the market continues in the right direction, at some point the stop loss will meet our entry level, providing us with a break-even trade. When the stop loss is at the same price that we entered the market, getting stopped out here will mean that we don't lose any money on the trade. Take two trades. One loses and one wins. Lose a trade for 10 pips and win a trade for 10 pips equals 0 pips in the bank. You get break even. Lose a trade for 9 pips when the stop was reduced only by 1 pip, and win a trade for 10 pips equals 1 pip in the bank. Conservative trailing. Now, using the TBM is the best way to allow the market to reach your profit target while reducing your risk on the trade. Now, this is the conservative method, and it's my method of choice. As the market moves, it won't choke out the position, get too close to the price, and have you prematurely stopped out of your trade. This image shows the initial stop loss being placed just above the TBM of the signal candle. As each new TBM dot appears above the price in this short trade example, the stop loss will be moved lower to just above the newest TBM dot. Now, eventually, one of three things will happen. Number one, we'll be taken out of the trade as the price hits our profit target. Number two, we will be taken out at a reduced loss as price hits our trailed stop loss. And number three, we'll get taken out at a small profit as the stop loss gets hit, but is in profit. Now, the trade goes our way, and with every new TBM dot that shows up, the stop loss is continually reduced. It is moved along in the direction of the trade. Now, eventually, we do get stopped out when the price touches the TBM. This is a great way to reduce your loss or capture as much of the market movement as it will allow. Aggressive trailing. Now, trailing the stop loss along the TBS is the most aggressive way to manage the trade. The TBS indicator follows along the market quite closely, and in doing so, has a few positive features along with some negative features. The pros for trailing along the TBS. It reduces the risk on the trade incredibly quickly. It won't give as much money back to the market when it turns against the trade and it gets stopped out. You will move your stop to break even much faster. Now, the cons are that the trade gets stopped out prematurely, and it's very vulnerable to choppy and sideways market conditions. We entered long on the close of the signal candle, and the initial stop loss is placed just below the TBS of that signal candle. The trade gets stopped out as a stop loss is touched by the price, but this doesn't happen for a while. As each new candle opens, and a new section of the TBS is drawn under the new candle, the stop will be moved up to the new section just below each new candle. Now there's a combination. Now with an aggressive entry signal, sometimes the only option that you have is to place your stop loss above or below the TBS, as the TBM isn't made available yet. If managing the stop loss along the TBM, or conservatively, is what you want to do, you will have to use a combination of the two trailing stop methods. First, the initial stop loss will be placed above or below the TBS as the trade is signaled. Next, we wait until the first TBM dot appears. We do not move the stop loss along the TBS. We just keep it frozen until the TBM appears. Finally, now that the first TBM dot does appear, we manage to stop along the TBM dots. This is an example of an entry. We enter aggressive as 3 out of the 4 signals, 3 out of the 4 indicators give us a signal, and then the initial stop loss is placed underneath the TBS. It will remain there until the first TBM dot appears. From there, the stop loss is trailed along the TBM dots. And this is a short example of that. Enter an aggressive short position on the close of this signal candle, as 3 of the 4 indicators are showing us a small red tetragram bar. The initial stop loss is placed just over the TBS, and it will remain there until the first TBM dot appears. From there, the stop is trailed along the TBM dots. Now, by looking at this example, you can see how that the market got close to the TBS and would have chopped us out if we had moved it along the TBS. Keeping our stop loss stationary until the TBM dot appears will save us from getting chopped out prematurely. Now, of course, the same will go the opposite way. Now, if you want to manage your trade along the TBS and your only option is to start with the TBM, use the TBM until the TBS appears and then switch over to the TBS.